welcome and thank you for joining us here for the launch of this report written by Size of Wales and Global Canopy, Saving for the Future, a report into Wales's public pension exposure to global deforestation. This is part of Size of Wales' campaign to make Wales a deforestation-free nation. We've got a panel of 3 speakers here today, plus video from the Guarani indigenous peoples from Brazil. And I think when I was reading this report, there was one thing that really stood out to me of the action that we can take locally and globally. And it's how this point that was made by the Guarani people in the foreword about how each person, each community, each country can dream of many ways that together we can act on this path to take care of the world that we share. And that core word for me is community. And when we act as a community rather as individuals, that's when we can really make a difference. For those of you who aren't aware, I think it's good to flag up what global responsibility means, and particularly for us in Wales as the first nation to have a Commissioner for Future Generations. And it's a nation that, when doing anything to improve the economic, social, environmental and cultural well-being of Wales, takes account of whether doing such a thing can make a positive contribution to global well-being. And I think this paper is a great start for us to think about some of those positive contributions that we can make. So I wanted to welcome our speakers. We have Barbara Davies-Cui, Deputy Director of Size of Wales. Barbara has 18 years experience of supporting Indigenous communities and local communities to protect their lands and forests, develop sustainable livelihood opportunities and tackle climate change in South America and Africa. Barbara has been leading Size of Wales policy work to tackle overseas deforestation footprint and make Wales a globally responsible nation. So I'll come to you before I make any other announcements of any of our other speakers and ask you to give us an overview.
Thank you everyone, Burada. It's such a pleasure to be here, and thank you so much particularly to Sarah for stepping in last minute, and for everyone else being here on the panel and for coming along today. So firstly, just a brief, who are Size of Wales? We are a climate charity based here in Wales with the aim of protecting and securing and sustaining tropical forests the size of Wales, which is 2 million hectares, if you didn't know. But not only do we support Indigenous and local communities to protect forests and grow millions of trees, we also take action here in Wales to kind of inspire climate action, but more recently wanting Wales to be the first deforestation nation in the world. And that means looking at our supply chains, looking at our investments, what food are we buying, how are we farming, etc. So that's kind of just about us. So why are we all here today in Cardiff, in Wales, talking about tropical forests? Why are they so crucial to us here in Wales when they are millions of miles away? Well, tropical forests are kind of homes to over 80% of terrestrial biodiversity. They are also home to 50 million people. They protect us from pandemics. So whilst COVID wasn't caused by tropical deforestation, previous pandemics have been, such as Ebola. And this is because zoonotic diseases have crossed over from animals into humans as a result of deforestation. So keeping forests alive also protects our health. They're a huge source of cancer drugs and other medicines. They protect us from flooding, landslides, coastal erosion. The Amazon even regulates our Gulf Stream, which makes the weather in Wales, well, a little bit wet, but also much more mild. And they are really our greatest asset in the fight against climate change. If you were to look at the CO2 emissions from global deforestation at the moment, they're around 11%. So if we really want to tackle CO2 emissions, we need to make sure that we kind of protect our forests. They are great carbon sinks. And we're already seeing worrying trends where places like Brazil, the Brazilian Amazon is actually tipping over into becoming a source of carbon rather than a carbon sink. So at COP26, I was there with some young people from Wales and Indigenous peoples and other sides of Wales staff. And there was a big kind of announcement made where governments from over 140 countries came together and said, we want to halt and reverse deforestation by 2030. But unfortunately, we're nowhere near on track with that commitment. Last year, 22.8 million hectares of forest, which is 11 times the size of Wales, were lost. And that's almost 1.5 rugby pitches lost every 2 seconds. To put that into perspective, that's around 450 rugby pitches while I'm been talking to you for 10 minutes. So that's, that's the size of the problem. And if you're just looking at tropical deforestation, last year we lost more than twice the size of Wales, and that's 33% off our target. So what is causing deforestation? Well, most deforestation is caused by a handful of agricultural commodities. You can see there in the top, that's timber, then you've got soy, which is mainly used for animal feed, beef, palm oil, coffee and cacao. But we also have other causes of deforestation, such as mining and other mega projects. But tropical forests are not just empty places where animals roam. They are also home to people, as I mentioned at the beginning. Sorry. And they are particularly home to Indigenous peoples. They have been the best guardians of our forests and have been protecting them for many years, but they face grave threats for that work that they do. And I'd like to just share, just to bring it all back to, why should we care about forests? Bring it back to the Guarani people who live in the Atlantic forest in Brazil. Unfortunately, 12% of the Atlantic forest is only remaining now. Lots of it has been deforested due to soy plantations. That soy is then imported here into Wales for us to use animal feed. And the Guarani people at COP27, at COP26, when we were with them, had a very strong message. You need to protect us as Indigenous peoples and our forests if we want to have a hope to tackle climate change. And I'm just going to now, we're going to hear a short video from the Guarani about the impact that soy is having on their land.
Falando sobre monocultura, né, sobre parte do impacto da plantação de soja aqui nas nossas aldeias, são bem fortes, né, porque as nossas aldeias não têm proteção. E só para falar que a plantação de soja está nesse lado, né, e da aldeia já é no outro lado. Então não tem proteção, né, então onde tem entrada e tem um lugar que tem uma casa já é plantação de soja. Então vem trazendo assim, muita causa, assim, bem complicado, né, porque nosso dia a dia, assim, né, a criança, tanto os animaizinhos que a gente cuida na nossa casa, né, às vezes passa veneno, mata, e também a criança vê, muito curioso ver a maquinário passando e passa na cara o veneno, né? Então essa é a nossa preocupação maior daqui na nossa região, principalmente na nossa aldeia, né? A gente tem pouco espaço e também a gente está bem apertado, né? A plantação ali e a gente mora, né, apertado ali, e cada vez mais o pessoal que planta soja, né, ele é cada vez mais empurrando a gente para, né, para a gente ficar bem assim apertado mesmo, né? Então, porque dois lados é plantação de soja e no meio as nossas aldeias. Então, onde a gente precisa, né, urgentemente também o espaço ou ampliação ou fazer alguma proteção próprio das aldeias. Tem muitas pessoas do outro lado do mundo que não sabem o que está acontecendo aqui no Brasil, né? Onde o povo indígena está sofrendo, né? Que nem daqui da região. A gente sabe onde que a soja está indo, né? Mas a pessoa que está levando para lá não sabe de onde que está levando, de qual lugar que está levando. Porque a soja que está plantado foi na terra indígena, né? Então, onde a gente está passando muito essa dificuldade e essa luta, né? E a pessoa que compra, eles não sabe, né? Então, aqui, né? Por exemplo, planta a soja, mata os indígenas, né? Dentro do território dos indígenas e leva esse produto para fora, né? Então, é um recado, acho que é tipo conhecer de onde que essa grão está indo, né? Essa plantação de soja está indo, né? E qual lugar que está indo, né? Para conhecer um pouco, porque a gente estamos sofrendo muito aqui questão desse impacto muito grande, questão da plantação de soja.
Thank you. So I think that video kind of just really highlighted the devastating impact that deforestation can have, not just for nature, but for people and planet. And just to pick up some facts there, the Guarani issues a report which looked into the impacts of soy, and they found 16 out of 27 pesticides used on their plantations are extremely or highly toxic. 11 of them are linked to chronic diseases such as cancer. 21 of those 27 pesticides are banned in the EU. And the US Environmental Protection Agency has classified 5 of them as carcinogenic. And I think just that drawing there by a Guarani child just is so devastating, where they're sat next to land that used to be forested. And now these are just endless rows of plantations that are then also having health impacts for the indigenous peoples. So why should Wales act? Well, as Sarah mentioned in the introduction, Wales has a fantastic piece of legislation called the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, introduced in 2015, which for the first time across the world put kind of in legislation that we should be thinking of future generations and doing everything possible to think of our long-term impacts when looking at decision making. And one of the 7 goals of the Wellbeing Act is to be a globally responsible Wales. So we must ensure that everything that we do here to improve our economic, social and cultural situation also takes into account whether doing such things have a positive contribution to global well-being. So there's a real strong call that everything that public sector bodies do here in Wales and Welsh Government also takes into account the global well-being. And I think tackling deforestation is one of those really urgent issues that we need to address when looking at global responsibility. Unfortunately, we are still lagging behind in terms of our ecological footprint. If the entire world lived like Wales, would need over 2 Earths to kind of use all those resources. So we are living beyond our planetary boundaries through the things that we consume, things that we invest in, and that's data from Welsh Government's most recent report in 2022. Wales also at COP26, that's the Wales's climate change minister, also made a statement to commit tackling Wales' overseas deforestation footprint. This was during a meeting with an Indigenous person from the One Piece Nation, the Pensiynau Galois, and Julie James committed to tackling Wales's overseas deforestation footprint. So there's kind of lots of momentum here in Wales to take action. So I think that's just a bit of background before we go into actually how a Welsh public sector pension funds link deforestation, just to end on the quote from the Guarani, which Sarah already highlighted, but they really hope that we learn from their way of life, how they harvest traditional seeds and care for their forest. And they want to unite energies to preserve life on the whole planet. And I think that's just the kind of message that we want to give everyone here today. I think already seeing the people in the room and online, I think if we can all come together, local authorities, NGOs, decision makers, communities themselves, we can really make a change here in Wales. So thank you. And I'm going to now pass.
Thanks.
Back to Sarah.
Thanks, Barbara. Yeah, I'd also like to welcome Emma Thompson. Emma leads Global Canopy's Forest 500 project, addressing companies and financial institutions with the greatest influence on tropical deforestation. She also leads on their technical work on deforestation free finance, developing the finance sector roadmap and sector-specific guidance, helping the finance sector work towards deforestation-free portfolios. Global Canopy is a UK NGO that identifies and makes data accessible and to enable companies, financial institutions and governments tackle their hidden sustainability risks. Welcome, Emma.
Thank you very much. Yes, so I want to start by just kind of reiterating that financial institutions have a critical role to play in eliminating deforestation globally. And they can use the leverage that their finance provides to drive change on the ground, on deforestation, on climate change, on human rights, and all sorts of other topics. And this applies to all financial institutions, so banks, asset managers, but also pension funds as well. So we heard from Barbara a lot about why deforestation is important globally, about why it's people of the planet, but I did also want to take a moment to talk through why is it important to pension funds specifically? Why should they care from their perspective? So predominantly, that is because it's also a risk to themselves as a pension fund. This flowchart that you can see on the screen shows how environmental and social impacts can translate into risks for companies. And so pension funds are predominantly exposed to deforestation risk through the clients or holdings that they finance. So this could be, as Barbara said, through those in beef, soy, palm, timber supply chains, but it could be through those on the ground, so say a Brazilian cattle rancher, or it could be from a European supermarket that's buying that beef. Those risks transfer throughout the supply chain. So as you can see, deforestation, as an example, can bring these 5 risks to companies in supply chains. So that could be market access due to changing consumer preferences around deforestation, policy, stricter deforestation-free commitments from others change business in general, the regulatory risk. With the recent EU due diligence regulation, companies could be facing up to 4% fines of their EU turnover if they're not compliant with that regulation. It causes reputational risks, as we've seen for companies with palm oil in particular, but also physical risks for companies, reduced crop yields, increased costs, which make the business less profitable. And that then translates to risk for the financial institution. It can be lower profitability due to lower cash flows and stranded assets, or it could be permanent loss of loan of investment values. Some of the largest agricultural companies are set to lose up to a quarter of their value by 2030. And so they are very real risks for financial institutions. But there are also reputational and compliance risks for financial institutions. And one of the key reasons for that is that momentum has been building for the finance sector to act on deforestation. So echoing quite a lot of what Barbara said, in 2021, the Glasgow Declaration on Forest and Land Use was signed. GFANZ and Race to Zero really rose to prominence. In 2022, the UN High-Level Expert Group on Net Zero announced that an expectation for financial institutions with net zero targets to have a 2025 target date to eliminate commodity-driven deforestation or be at risk of greenwashing. GFANZ, so the Glasgow Financial Alliance on Net Zero, added action on deforestation to transition planning guidance and recommendations. And the Global Biodiversity Framework was also agreed, which included requirements on deforestation. Then in 2023, really bringing in the compliance risk, the EU have committed to review the EU due diligence regulation for its applicability to the finance sector, and whether financial institutions should also be expected to be compliant with that regulation. But now, onto the analysis itself. So this is a very brief recap of how this analysis was conducted. Firstly, we sent freedom of information requests to each of the 8 pension funds in the Wales Pension Partnership, as well as one to the partnership as a whole. We requested a lot of information from those pension funds, one of which was the GICS, which is Global Industry Classification System, for sub-industries, so that we could identify the deforestation risk, ideally of each individual investment, or at least for each fund, if that information wasn't available. We used data, Forest IQ data, and Forest 500 selection data to determine whether each of those GICS sub-industries had a high risk of being linked to deforestation, a likely risk meaning we know that it's exposed to deforestation, but the extent of that risk is unknown, or no known risk. So what we found was that £2.6 billion of the investments in the Wales Pension Partnership are at a high risk of financing deforestation. That translates into at least 1 in every £10 of those investments. To dig into this in a little more detail, in the orange segment of this pie chart, which is that 10%, that is the £2.6 billion reflected there. If we then also look at the percentage of finance that are known to be likely exposed to deforestation risk, which is the dark green colour, we see that 45% of the total assets under management in clients' holdings is likely exposed to that deforestation risk. That means in total, 55% of the investments of the Wales Pension Partnership are either at a high risk or likely exposed to deforestation risk. Collectively, that is equivalent to £14 billion. Now, to narrow in on individual pension funds exposure, I'm going to try my best to do the pronunciation correctly, but please bear with me. Thank you. I've written it phonetically, so please bear with me. So I'm just going to start very high level with these graphs that you can see. So Torfaen, Dyfed, Gwyneth, Cardiff, Abermorganeg, Clwyd, Powys, all have relatively high, all have relatively high exposure through either high or exposed to deforestation risk. But then when we look at Powys and Rhondda Cynon Taf, we see that they have a significantly lower exposure to deforestation risk. Then I'm going to dig into that in more detail on this table here. So as you can see, there is the list of all of the pension funds on the left-hand side. Then in orange, we have the high exposure to deforestation risk, and then in dark green, the likely exposure. So we can see their investment in pounds. So not just what proportion of their financing is high risk, but actually what that means in practice. So Dyfed has 15% of their assets under management as high risk. When we look at the amount of money that represents, Clwyd are providing the most finance to high-risk clients or holdings, representing nearly £0.9 billion. And they also have £3.7 billion that's likely exposed to deforestation. Meanwhile, as I mentioned earlier, Powys has the lowest exposure to high-risk clients or holdings, representing just 2% of their total investments, which is the equivalent of £16 million. We also, within the report, included a set of recommendations. There is no better time for pension funds and other financial institutions to start acting on deforestation, conversion, and the associated human rights abuses. Over the past kind of 2-3 years in particular, there has been a wealth of guidance, of tools that have all been developed to enable pension funds and other financial institutions to drive change through the leverage that their finance provides. So the first thing that financial institutions, and particularly pension funds, can do is to identify deforestation risk. Do an initial risk assessment followed by a detailed risk assessment. Where is the risk for their individual pension fund? Is it through a particular sector of companies? Is it through a particular commodity? What does that look like? So they can then better deal with that exposure. The second step would be to set a strong public deforestation policy. In line with best practice, that would include deforestation, conversion, and the associated human rights abuses. So particularly labour rights, the free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous peoples and local communities, customary rights to land, resources, and territory, and having a zero tolerance approach for violence and threats against forest, land, and human rights defenders. Ideally, that would be to a 2025 target date, in line with the UN High-Level Expert Group's recommendations, or as soon as possible thereafter. They should also be engaging with clients or holdings that are client, either directly or managed. A lot of pension funds do have a really unique relationship to deforestation risk because of the way that they are set up with their asset managers. There's plenty of guidance for pension funds on how to go about this process, but that engagement should have clear expectations of what compliance looks like, and also have a process for how finance could potentially be redirected if change isn't made and isn't made quick enough. Then also transparent report on the progress that is being made to address these issues. Pension fund scheme holders, but also the wider public, do want to know what pension funds are doing on these issues. They want to see that their money is being invested in a positive way. And I think on that note, I will hand back to Sarah.
Thank you. Thanks, Emma, for the work and for the amazing pronunciation. We're going to come back to Barbara, who's going to tell us a little more about what we can do here in Wales.
Thanks, Sarah. Just a quick slide, really, and I think just to build on what Emma was saying, there is a lot of information out there. We can't pretend that we don't know how to change our kind of finance and investment schemes. I think particularly there has been a lot of focus on fossil fuel industries, but now thanks to the work that organisations such as Global Canopy are doing, there is a lot more information to be able to trace your kind of deforestation risk and look at the data and know what action you should be taking. There is already guidance available, and I think something that we can really do here in Wales is learn from others. Global Canopy are working with local authorities across the UK, and in the report there is an example of a local authority grouping in London that are already taking action. So I think one suggestion would be to kind of work across the nation and other nations and see what other countries and councils are doing on the issue of pension funds. It's really essential that we take action on our deforestation risk in terms of our pension exposure. And this is essential for the Welsh public sector to meet their targets of reaching net zero by 2030. We also know that under the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, public sector bodies need to report annually on their actions. And I think that's an opportunity under the globally responsible goal for pension funds and local authorities to report against these targets. And I think we can also build and replicate on positive action that is being taken across Wales, and I'm sure Chris will be going into more detail on that, but I'm just picking out two examples. So Swansea City Council, County Council, Green Investment have a kind of commitment to reach net zero by 2037, and they have also, under the Welsh Pension Partnership, set up an active sustainable equity sub-fund just set up in June 2023, which excludes investments in palm oil industry. So we can see some examples of positive action already being taken that will obviously help us reduce the exposure to deforestation risk, but definitely a lot more action needs to be taken. And as Emma said, the first step is like knowing the data. We've obviously got it here at a high level. We can share all the analysis, the kind of detailed, like lots of spreadsheets that I'm sure sit behind all this analysis with each local authority pension fund, you know, make those commitments and then really see where is best practice already happening, where can we kind of learn from that and take action.
Thanks, Barbara. Before I come to Councillor Chris Weaver, I just wanted to mention a little about Race to Zero Cymru. So you mentioned Race to Zero, and that's born out of COP, the UNFCCC mission requiring all members, non-state actors like companies, cities, local authorities, regions to take immediate action to halve global emissions by 2030. At Oxfam Cymru, we've spearheaded Race to Zero Cymru, working with Climate Cymru and the Bannau Brycheiniog to encourage all of our local authorities in Wales to join that mission and that race to zero. And we think that this paper is the perfect example of how local authorities can lead and work together to enable us to achieve climate justice. So Chris, I would like to come to you, but just to mention, you're the Labour Councillor for Cathays Ward in Cardiff, the Cabinet Member for Finance, Modernisation and Performance, and most importantly, Chris chairs Cardiff Council's Pensions Committee. Welcome, Councillor.
Thank you very much, and thanks for inviting me here today. It's a really important topic and one I'm very pleased to engage with. I'm here primarily as I'm the chair of the Cardiff and Vale Pension Committee, and I sit on a governance body for the Wales Pension Funds. And I've been asked to sort of explain a couple of things that I think are very relevant to this debate and this report, which I'm really pleased to see launched today. So first of all, a kind of overview of how pensions are organised in Wales. There are 8 different pension funds across Wales. We're under the Local Government Pension Scheme. This isn't devolved, so we're under UK government legislation. It's an England and Wales scheme. Those 8 funds represent primarily local authority workers, although there are other employers in the scheme, often sort of small colleges and education institutions. Over sort of a decade ago, the UK government made it clear it wanted the pension funds around the country that mostly were based around 1 or 2 local authorities to pool together to form larger funds. And the sort of driver behind that was around, you can drive out economies of scale, you can achieve lower fees, you can open up some new asset classes to invest in if your overall fund of investment is larger. So Cardiff's fund at the moment is valued at about £2.6 billion, but across Wales, it's about 10 times that. So when we pooled, the Welsh authorities pooled together as the 8 funds, and we formed the Welsh Pension Partnership in 2017. As the chair of the Cardiff and Vale Pension Committee, I sit on a joint governance committee with the 7 other chairs of the relevant pension committees, and that's the elected member governance of the Wales Pension Partnership. There's also an officer working group behind that, so officers from the council, the 8 pension funds all work together. And they have a working group, and they have a subgroup that I think is very relevant to the work identified here on responsible investment, because it is something the Wales Pension Partnership recognises as really important. Each individual pension fund sets its own investment strategy. That still remains the case even within pooling. But obviously, as you can see, when all these funds are pooled together, there is clearly a need for increased collaboration, because the expectation is that the funds will invest in the investment opportunities together. So the collaboration between the authorities has grown as we've formally pooled. So I'm going to talk a little around what action's going on around net zero under those arrangements. And there is a lot going on in Wales, and it's growing in importance, and I'm delighted to see that. I've been the chair of the Cardiff and Vale Pension Committee since 2017, and you know, what I have seen in terms of the industry's discussion around this and the increase in data available to local authorities and financial institutions is a massive growing importance of this topic. Net zero in general, climate change, deforestation, decarbonisation, all are becoming genuinely more relevant topics as more and more investors are looking for investments that meet the ambitions that everyone is trying to set. There are a few, so at the Wales Pension Partnership level, there are a few policies that I think are relevant here. We do have a climate risk policy and a responsible investment policy that sets out the Wales Pension Partnership belief that sustainable investment is crucial to us as the 8 funds, that we recognise that the environmental, social and governance factors, ESG factors, that you take into account when making decisions are crucial to, as Emma was saying, to actually better investments, that the higher investment score on those ratings, the better long-term investment you are making. And of course, as a pension fund, what you're thinking about, we're thinking about how to make investments so that we can pay members pensions, not just now, but in decades and decades' time. So taking that long, sustainable view is really important to us. The Wales Pension Partnership is signed up to the UK Stewardship Code, so that there's commitments there around reporting and action on responsible investment. And this has led to a number of sort of decisions in terms of the investment opportunities that the Wales Pension Partnership provides to the pension funds. So the Sustainable Active Equity Fund was mentioned by Barbara there. It was launched this year. Cardiff and Vale is one of the authorities that are invested in that. This does have an exclusion on palm oil as well as a number of other things. It sets essentially a higher target on decarbonisation and climate action than just a market benchmark would. There's a number of sort of decarbonisation overlays we've added to various investment pots that the Wales Pension Partnership organises that again seek to move faster than the market does towards decarbonisation. And there's been a lot of discussion around our opportunities in private markets, including infrastructure, in terms of how we can make a positive investment in things like renewable energy schemes, so that the funds we're putting towards that are actually actively supporting that just transition. And there is a statement and commitment from the WPP to explore how we can explicitly link our investment opportunities to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Now, obviously, what we can't carry out all this work ourselves, so we've procured a number of companies to organise these. So we have a company that organises and arrange our investment funds. We also have a company who we have procured to engage to carry out our voting and engagement work, a company called Robeco. So this is the point Emma was making around as shareholders, as pension funds, we own significant assets, we have voting rights as shareholders, and we can engage with companies. And of course, collectively, as a larger pool of investment, I think the opportunity for that engagement has strengthened. And Robeco are the company we have who carry that out for us, and they report back again against the UN Sustainable Development Goals around how that engagement is going. At the fund level, the 8 different funds, there's also lots of work going on, around net zero. And we are at slightly different places, as you would expect from funds that have their own investment approach. But Barbara mentioned sort of Swansea's target that their fund has set for net zero position by 2037. Gwynedd have talked in their responsible investment strategy approach of a final target of net zero by 2050, but with the commitment to assess and review whether that can be delivered 5, 10, 15, or even 20 years earlier. So they've kind of set a sort of hard goal, but with that assessment through. Cardiff and the Vale at the moment is going through a series of workshops with some advisors on how, on where and what we should set as a target in terms of net zero. And the challenge for any pension fund when it's talking about net zero is, of course, the public sector is committed in Wales to be net zero by 2030, and we're fully supportive of that. What pension funds do, of course, is we do hold some government bonds, but a lot of investments are in private companies globally. So in order to achieve net zero in terms of our investments, we will need the economy to become net zero so that those opportunities exist. It doesn't have to be the entire economy, because you could exclude those that are failing to reach that level. But so this is the challenge we have. What we can do as pension funds, though, is if we set ourselves these targets and we actively go out to the market to ask for these investments that will bring us to net zero, we are creating demand for those products, and therefore there is money available for people who will reach those ambitious levels. Deforestation is recognised as a climate risk and issue within our discussion around responsible investment in the WPP, but really welcome this as a chance to understand the data more clearly, and to try and shape action as we go forward. And I think what I'm really looking forward to being able to discuss this with my colleagues across the other 8 funds, and how we, as the eight funds in Wales, can use our work on responsible investment to sort of further deepen this, making it relevant for the specific investments we hold. Robeco, who I mentioned, who manage our voting and engagement position, they have been carrying out a sort of deforestation engagement activity since 2020. It was launched specifically targeting around Brazil, recognising the critical nature of deforestation there. It has since expanded, I think, to engagement with in Indonesia and Australia as well. They engage with government, they engage with civil society, they engage with companies. I think what is notable is that the change of government in Brazil perhaps has given a different opportunity for that engagement. The progress perhaps has been more rapid in the last few months than it was in those first years. But that's the kind of thing that pension funds can also do, which is support that sort of engagement with countries. When you are talking about investments of billions of pounds, you can carry some voice. Overall, I think this is really valuable to helping us move forward in the net zero work. Every pension fund recognises this is the challenge that we all face, and pension funds can play their part. And we're all trying to deepen our understanding of how we can do so and how we can do it quickly. Net zero and just transition and climate risk are important to the 8 funds. We obviously have a clear duty to make sure we can provide those pensions to the members. That is the legal and fiduciary duty. But that clearly, when you're talking about something that has to be delivered in decades' time, has to involve that commitment to sustainable investment. So supporting this approach and further understanding around deforestation and what we can do is something we're really keen to engage with and get involved with. So very grateful to be here today. Really looking forward to taking this report back to the other funds and seeing what we can do collectively together to help address this.
Thank you very much, Councillor. We're going to come back to Emma to have a look at guidance for action on public sector pension funds.
Yes, thank you very much. So we wanted to give a little more insight into what tools and guidance are available for pension funds to start acting on these issues. We do often start on the data point here that there isn't enough data, the data's not good enough. But over the past 2-3 years, as I mentioned, there has been a really concerted effort from lots of different stakeholders to improve the data, both the quality and the coverage of that data. So one example I'd like to draw upon is Forest IQ, which we used as part of this analysis. So Forest IQ launched officially on the 1st of November this year, and it is a global canopy project and tool that brings together multiple different data sets on company and financial institution action on deforestation, on conversion, and associated human rights abuses. So it's bringing all of these different data sets together for the finance sector. So it's designed for financial institutions. It's been developed with a working group of financial institutions. It is designed for them to be able to access the data set, download, and use it for exactly what they need it for. So it brings all these data sets together with combined metrics that bring 4, 5, 6 different data sets of hundreds of thousands of data points together into what is the key takeaway, what is the more detailed takeaway, and then the full detailed data if that's what's needed. So Forest IQ is available now, and you can access it either by searching Forest IQ or on the Global Canopy website. But I also wanted to talk about the Deforestation Free Finance guidance. So as we mentioned earlier, there is both rather multiple sets of guidance now, but we started with a finance sector roadmap in 2021, which is applicable to all financial institutions. It's high level but detailed. And then in June last year, with Make My Money Matter and Systemic, we published the guidance for pension funds. So here is a bit of a summary of what is a very, very detailed piece of guidance. So it's designed that a pension fund could go from never having really thought about deforestation before, in theory, to being able to identify that risk, address that risk, and eliminate that risk. And then also go above and beyond, so looking at nature positive, people positive, and more of that positive investment as well. So the roadmap, as you can see here, I'll talk through it very, very briefly, goes from understanding and mapping that risk. How can a initial high-level risk assessment be conducted? What data sets are there? What guidance is there? What have other pension funds done to show how that can be done? That's the first phase. Then the second phase moves on to kind of setting an effective policy. What does that policy look like? What are all of the human rights that should be covered? What does deforestation mean? And then also managing that risk. What does that engagement look like? How do you set that out in a policy? And what can that look like? The third phase moves on to monitoring and engagement. So actually taking that policy and turning it into practice. How can you identify which clients or holdings are non-compliant? How can that be done effectively? What tools, what guidance is all in there? How can engagement work in line with best practice? Moving on to phase 4, it's about disclosure, reporting that progress, highlighting results of risk assessments, making that information publicly available for pension fund scheme holders, but also to help encourage other pension funds to make that progress as well, to show that others are moving forward. Then the 5th phase is eliminating deforestation, conversion, and associated human rights abuses. It's obviously a lot more complicated than it sounds, and it is in that phase is guidance on what can be done, where could thresholds be set for when finance can be removed if enough progress hasn't been made. And there's also guidance in there on what that can look like. This guidance was developed with a working group of pension funds across predominantly England, but it has been developed over about 6 to 9 months with a lot of detailed consultations with that working group, and they are all, it was a real team effort, and some of them are now using this guidance in practice. And I can point you to those examples if that would be helpful. This is available as well on the Global Canopy website if you'd like to look there. Thank you.
Thanks, Emma. So I think we've covered all of those main points here and objectives that we had. We're all now more aware of the deforestation exposure of the Welsh public sector pensions to deforestation. We've examined what those risks are, talked about recommendations on how we can invest in a way that meets our well-being goals. But what I wanted to do now is give our audience a chance to ask some questions. I'll come first to those online to give them an opportunity to input, and Caden's going to help out with that. So if you want to start with questions and call them out from there, Caden, and then that gives the people in the room a chance to come up with their own questions.
Yes, so first of all, we've got a lot of, just praise to see that there is growing momentum in Wales to take action on ongoing global deforestation. We've got one specific question here. How do we get public awareness of deforestation risk to the level that it needs to be to support buy-in for the dramatic shifts in investment and consumption needed to move the needle on this critical issue? So yeah, how do we get that public awareness of this risk of deforestation now?
Who would like to take that one?
Well, I think it's all of our responsibility to get public awareness. I think the government holds a certain responsibility to raise awareness, particularly because we have the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, and we know that we need to bring communities with us if we want to get to net zero. So any engagement communication tools that we can use to work with communities. What we're doing is working with communities in Monmouth at the moment to make Monmouth the first deforestation free community in Wales and possibly the world. And we're working through schools, we're working through businesses, we're working through with the local authority, with farmers, and local kind of action groups such as ACE. And I think by working with such a broad spectrum of people, particularly young people who totally understand the problem and want to see a solution, and their energy, their enthusiasm, their desire to see change builds a whole momentum around that movement. So I think we have to all come together. We have to realise we're not just, an isolated community here in Wales. We have those global impacts, and connecting ourselves to the people that are facing the real threats of climate change, I think, can also empower us to make change. So I think we have to, try and build those communities for action. I think there's lots of organisations doing that across Wales. There's lots of good practice. Obviously, the Future Generation Commissioner's Office, who couldn't be here today, is also kind of taking that work forward. And we know that there's real desire from Welsh Government as well. They set up a net zero challenge group to see if we can get to net zero even sooner. So I think there is a lot of momentum, but we do need to engage with people in a very clear language about what the impacts, and show them the solutions. Because I think with pensions, investing in ethical, responsible pension funds is also good for the pension holder themselves, because they're going to get better returns on the investment. So I think also showing the advantages of taking action is really important.
Thank you. Chris, is there anything you'd like to add from a local authority level?
Yeah, I mean, well, I'd agree with the points Bob made. I think when you're trying to sort of shape and influence public opinion as well, I think it's really important to make it relatable. So that could be in terms of linking it to the kind of products you buy, because you can understand how you're directly relating to that, or just the comparisons you use in terms of how many rugby pitches are being cut down in the time I've spoken to you. I think it's a really powerful way of people humanising what is otherwise a very large and difficult to comprehend impact. So, and I think all levels of government as well have a responsibility to make the point around why this is important, how this impacts Wales, and why we have a responsibility to act. So I think local government setting, as we have a sort of net zero target, and having a commitment to tackling climate change and using our voice to amplify it is part of that.
Yeah, thank you. Caden, any more questions from online?
I think we've got some more coming through, but maybe we'll go to the room for a second.
I'll come down to the front first of all. There's a microphone on its way.
Hi, Steph Stairs from Waterloo Foundation. I was interested, Chris, you mentioned that the company you commissioned to look at your pensions, Rebecca, had been looking at deforestation since 2020. I wonder if that had actually resulted in any action, either in divestments or in positive kind of nature, positive investments. And a second question, sorry, Emma, you mentioned that you'd engaged with pension providers on the guidance, and that some of those are now using it, which implies some are not, and I wondered why.
Thank you.
In terms of the engagement that the company have done with Brazil, what they were doing was they were looking to use their engagement to make impact in that in the country. So it wasn't at that stage looking at, do you make exclusions? It was to see what change they could make. And I think they recognised in the report that progress was very slow under the previous government, despite some verbal commitments. Nonetheless, action wasn't following. I think the big sort of action they've seen, and they've brought together, they've been part of the conversation with government and civil society and companies, is around clear and transparent reporting, so that you can understand what each business is actually doing in terms of that, so you can trace the timber that's being used. You can trace agricultural produce, so you know whether it's come from a sustainably managed farm or business, or whether it hasn't, because that's one of the massive problems. And I think that would help dramatically, because if you're looking to make a responsible investment, we will still need an agricultural industry in a net zero world, but what we need is for it to operate in a sustainable way that does not harm the environment, does not cause deforestation, does not cause the human rights issues that we've heard about today. So understanding where your produce comes from is critical to that. Then you can make investments in those companies that are doing the right thing, and not invest in those that are not.
Thank you. Should we come to that other question?
Yes, thank you. Yes, so the reason I said someone not using the guidance is because I was basing on public disclosure of the usage of the guidance. So the particular ones I was referring to have, in their recent responsible investment, sustainable investment reports, actively referenced our guidance, and that they were in the working group, and where they're at in the phases of the guidance, and they're kind of the results of those first steps. There are some pension funds that were in the working group privately, and that was not publicly disclosed, so I can't refer to them. But the examples of those pension funds, I will check if I can share, but I believe so. The majority, I think, are still at kind of phase 1 and maybe the beginnings of phase 2 of the guidance. We found that pension funds, particularly, well, some of the pension funds there was kind of a climate versus deforestation, and a lot of pressure with net zero to focus on climate as the priority. And then a large part of the guidance is about how deforestation is part of any net zero commitment and how they work together, and deforestation is almost a gateway to more climate action more broadly. So yes, but anyone that wants to know which pension funds are using our guidance publicly, then I can double check with my colleagues and let you know in the coffee afterwards.
Thank you. We had a question just in the middle row here.
Thank you. A question for Emma, really. Firstly, thank you very much for a really clear presentation, really concise, and particularly on the methodology and things. I'm sorry, Paul Mathias from RBC Brewendorf, so I'm an investment manager. In terms of the recommendations, the first one is about setting a strong public policy, and I wondered to what extent, if all the pension funds were to do that now, they'd be considered a leader or a laggard in that regard. Where are we at with that? And the second one was really that this focuses a lot of engagement, which is brilliant to see, actually, but I would say contrasts with a lot of other campaigns and things out there that focus really on divestment. And it talks about it in this context as being, you talk about funds being redirected away if the engagement is not sufficient. So I just wondered if you had any comment on why you didn't go straight to divestment.
Yes, so we, Global Canopy, launched our Deforestation Action Tracker earlier this month, and in that we assessed all of the financial institutions in the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero and Race to Zero as well on their deforestation policies, and we found that 75% didn't have a publicly available deforestation policy. So I would say, in terms of as a percentage of financial institutions, having a publicly available ambitious deforestation policy is still a sign of leadership. It is still a clear statement of this is our commitment and we are ahead of the pack. But I do think that given the time between now and 2025 and even 2030, we do need to rapidly be moving beyond setting a policy. But I would say it is still leading at this moment in time, but there is, policies are in many ways meaningless without effective implementation, and there shouldn't be too much emphasis placed on those policies. They are a really clear statement to make. And then on the engagement versus divestment approach, engagement is key for financial institutions, especially pension funds. Their financing becomes leverage. It is a way that they can drive change through effective and comprehensive engagement with clear expectations and a clear process in place to do that engagement with those clear expectations identify the highest risk clients, then the next high risk, the medium risk, and work through that way to encourage them to drive change on the ground, to improve their practices. And then remaining invested is a way to drive that change. Once that investment has gone, that influence is reduced significantly. So we do advocate for an engagement approach with the expectation that if those requirements and expectations are reached, that finance is then removed when appropriate.
Thank you. We had one question down here, and then we'll take two at the other end of the room.
Good morning. So my name's Robert Chapman. I'm a strategic property advisor. I operate in the private sector. These are rapid fire observations. I hope they're questions as well. So I haven't read the report, but congratulations to you on producing the report. I get a sense that it's a kind of an audit because, and this echoes the point made by the gentleman earlier, I was thinking about disinvestment, not only in deforestation, but also in fossil fuels, fossil fuel investments. And I saw the parallel. I realized this is about deforestation, but what about fossil fuel investments as well? Linked to that, then I wondered about if you're disinvesting from certain investments or types of investments, would you then reinvest in renewables? Might you invest in forestry creation, woodland creation? And finally, is there scope to use this research to influence the business sector, which, with my experience, is an absolute laggard?
Thank you. I think there was a lot to cover there, so we'll come to your question after. Barbara, can I come to you?
I'm just going to go with the last one first, and then maybe the others can take. But just in terms of business and the role businesses can play, we have a deforestation free business toolkit. We're starting to work with businesses across Wales to become deforestation free. We already have a number of businesses signed up to doing that, and within that we call on all businesses to look at their pension providers. It is a very tricky thing to do the analysis on. We also went through it ourselves as a charity to make sure that we're walking the walk. But that's something that definitely we are working with local authorities, but also we have guidance for businesses, not just on their procurement and ethical supply chains, but also on pensions. So I would agree with you definitely that there could be more that we could do on that. The UK has got in the UK Environment Act a due diligence on forest risk commodities. We're waiting for the secondary legislation to come in, so all businesses across the UK will have to look at their supply chains, but finance at the moment isn't within that scope. We're hoping that it will come into that scope at some time, and the EU is already talking about finance being brought in as well. So either way, businesses are going to have to make the change soon because regulation is coming down the line. So you can either get prepared now or you're going to be like falling way behind.
Thanks. Chris?
Yeah, I'll come in on the issue of divestment or engagement because it's long been a debate within the pension world. And overall, pension funds primarily look to engagement because we do hold such large investments across the economy. We know many businesses are not at a net zero point, but they can and will get there if we engage and support them in doing so. And there are advantages to that, and there are things that as a shareholder you can do in terms of transparency, reporting, and adhering to internationally agreed standards that actually help industry move on. I think for me though, and for the Cardiff Fund, we have discussed specifically around fossil fuel extraction that we are exploring, and obviously we have to be able to do this practically, but we're exploring whether we can exclude on that basis. And because whilst almost every other industry will have a future in a net zero world, the one industry that can't is fossil fuel extraction. So for us, that's why we're examining, looking at excluding it. But we have on particularly challenging issues excluded some products. So for example, in the Sustainable Active Equity Fund, we've excluded palm oil just because of the severe risk that poses there. And it's a constant debate within investment circles. I think Emma summed up quite well really how most of the pension fund industry is going to approach this. to try and use engagement first, but ultimately there has to be that consideration of divestment. I think my personal view is that that should be actively looked at around fossil fuel extraction, and I think if action isn't quick in other industries, there will be other areas where you'll need to look at in the future.
Thank you. Caden, I'll check any more questions online.
We do have one. Sorry, no, we should do the online first, just because it is 11 o'clock. Okay, so looking at solutions, with deforestation for transition minerals becoming a rapid driver of deforestation, how can we ensure that the energy transition doesn't entrench the same issues around human rights and environmental impacts as the race to commodify products like palm oil, cattle, and soy? What safeguards are being put in place to ensure this doesn't happen?
Thank you. So at the moment, minerals and heavy metal mining is it. So the leading causes of global deforestation, specifically tropical deforestation, 90% of that is linked to agriculture at the moment. Mineral-driven and heavy metal mining deforestation is a really, really significant issue in specific regions. So it isn't necessarily driving as much globally, but is in specific communities and places extremely significant and by far the leading cause of deforestation in those regions. It is very much at risk of, well, it is already linked to conversion, deforestation, human rights abuses, and also lots of other environmental issues as well. There is an increasing focus on, I'm speaking of this from my my Forest 500 side of the work of my work, around assessments of companies that are mining. So for instance, in the Forest IQ data set, there is some assessments of mining companies in there. It is a really big risk, but there is a lot of pressure on those companies as well to follow the same best practice as any other company linked to deforestation. It should be deforestation free with a specific cutoff date, after which any deforestation would be remediated. There should be no human rights abuses associated with that as well. There are, of course, specific differences around exactly which human rights are most prevalent in different commodities. But there is a lot of increasing focus. I would say actually a lot of that focus has come from the finance sector, interestingly, that there's been a real push from financial institutions, more data for in particular, which is really great to see. And I think that these issues can be tackled really well together. Commodity-driven deforestation, although we've been talking about agricultural, still can be addressed in the same way with mining. There are those kind of minute differences, but they can be addressed in a very similar way.
Thank you. I'll take a second just to thank those people online, just in case they need to go. But it seems we have got such an interesting conversation. I will give us a few more minutes because we did have another question here.
Many thanks. John Ray, I work for the Welsh Local Government Association. So I had a question for Emma, really, and thanks for the exposition. Emma. I thought it was really, really insightful. It was just a question about the data, really. Do you have any more data for any of the other local government pension schemes or any other schemes that I suppose are in the Welsh public sector? And there aren't many, because there's probably only the University Superannuation Scheme and the Senedd Commission. But actually some of the Welsh pension schemes perform rather well. I know, looking at some of the fossil fuel investments, I mean, Cardiff and Vale almost imperceptible exposure. I know as you move west a little bit higher levies, but it's always good to understand, I think, what is kind of good practice in a kind of wide levies with a wider data set.
Yes, so that's my thoughts. I think there are two main kind of data sets that I would personally draw on. So the first one would be in our Forest 500 selection process, which did inform part of this analysis. We identify the most influential companies and financial institutions on deforestation. And for the financial institutions, that is about how much finance they are providing to 350 companies that we select as being the most influential. So off the top of my head, I can't remember all 150, but I don't believe that any of the Welsh pension funds are in the Forest 500, those 150 financial institutions. We do also have our Deforestation Action Tracker, which I mentioned earlier, for financial institutions in GFANZ and Race to Zero. And part of that assessment includes a similar analysis to that Forest 500, where we've identified their exposure to those 350 companies, so the amount of finance that they're putting into those companies. Again, I can't remember all of the numbers off the top of my head, but there are some financial institutions that are, represent a huge amount of global finance into commodity risk companies. But I think the value of a pooled pension fund is that collective action that can happen, is that as individual pension funds, they do still have a significant influence, but by joining together, they can drive much more change by using all of their investments and pushing them all in the right way. So I think, although, in the context of maybe some of the biggest asset managers in the world, is, there is still a really significant amount of finance here. 2.6 billion pounds is high risk. 14 is high risk or likely exposed to deforestation. That is still a huge amount of money that can really be used to drive change on the ground.
Can I just add that we haven't looked at those areas partly because of timing and funding, but I think it's definitely something, particularly the Pensiynau funds, that we could look at a kind of follow-up action. And I think something that was mentioned in the earlier question was about audits, and I think this is a snapshot now of this, where we are now in 2023. I think we would be looking at, doing something similar and seeing what has changed in a few years' time, to kind of use this as the baseline now for action, particularly as we're seeing funds emerge, as I mentioned before. So I think it's something we can use to track performance, and maybe also look at opportunities of connecting local authority pension funds here with some of the ones that are maybe a bit more taking some action. So, for example, in London, the group in there already doing some action, so that we can look at that kind of auditing, but also sharing best practice. But yeah, I think we could definitely look at the Senate. When actually the Minister for Climate Change was very interested in us doing that when I spoke to her last week. So I think we can follow that up with them at another time.
Fabulous. Well, I think what a great point to close on. We've talked a lot about momentum, engaging all levels of community, civil society, of government, clear and transparent reporting, and some conversation about net zero versus deforestation, engagement versus divestment. And I think the importance is that none of these things can be done alone. They all have to be done together. And I think for me, to close, it's rapid action and how Wales really can lead the way. I'd like to thank Barbara, Emma and Councillor Weaver, and also thank the Guarani people for the insightful video that we have from them, and everyone online for joining us. Apologies, we ran over slightly. And for everyone here in the room, we do have coffee and Welsh cakes after if you wanted to stay around for a chat. Diolch yn fawr everyone for joining us.